Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping inside the walls of what one man calls Black Site Berlin, a German penal psychiatry unit. What you're about to hear is his harrowing first-person account of isolation, corruption, and psychological warfare.
So imagine this. 18 months into his confinement, the buyer of the World Succession Deed 1400 is refusing to speak with any psychologists. He recounts being surrounded by 8 staff members who gave him a very clear choice. Either you start therapy or you go into isolation forever.
And that was his answer. For that simple act of defiance, he says they immediately put him in shackles, hands and feet, and dragged him off to an isolation cell. For the next 4 months, this was his entire world. He was given just a thin, knee-length shirt with smiley faces printed on it, leaving him freezing on the cold floor. There was no clock, and the light was never, ever turned off. Time just dissolved. He describes it as a completely dehumanizing experience, all of it built around one constant threat. You will never get out of this room unless you submit to therapy.
But then, out of nowhere, he was released from isolation. He never agreed to therapy, but they let him out anyway. He was moved to a new ward, Station 10B, which was supposedly getting a huge, expensive renovation.
Yeah, about that renovation, his account paints a very different picture from the official reports talking about a multi-million euro project. He saw what they were doing firsthand, and he calls it a complete and utter sham. The reality he describes is just bleak. He's talking about rooms being renovated in an hour or two. The floors weren't new, just patched. The walls were still covered in dents and old stains. Nothing was really fixed or replaced. He calls it a blatant embezzlement of taxpayer money, orchestrated, in his words, by the deep state, who knew patients were the perfect victims. Because who would ever believe their story? So after this quick and dirty cleanup, the so-called renovated wing gets its new residents. The entire ward was converted into a unit specifically for sex offenders. And as you can probably guess, the environment became incredibly tense and very dangerous. And that danger became personal, fast. He recounts being lured into a room by another patient, supposedly just to check out a CD. But once he was inside, he says another inmate was there waiting, the door was blocked, and he was ambushed. He had to literally fight his way out to escape what he was absolutely certain was a planned sexual assault. And this corruption, he alleges, went way beyond just shoddy renovations. He describes this whole unseen economy running through the ward, a thriving and violent drug trade that was operating, he claims, with direct help from the staff. According to his account, the system was disturbingly simple. A specific nurse would supply an inmate with drugs and alcohol. That inmate then acted as the dealer, selling everything at a huge markup. All the cash, he says, went straight back to the nurse. And the dealer's payment? Free drugs for himself, which only fueled more violence and chaos on the ward. But he argues the corruption went even deeper. He alleges the institution itself was the biggest dealer of all. He says patients figured out exactly which symptoms to fake, like depression or ADHD, to get prescriptions for powerful, addictive medications. The official pharmacy essentially became what he calls the Black Site drugstore. After 6 weeks, he was moved again, this time to a single room on Station 10A. And you'd think, finally, a little bit of safety, a door he could lock. But the torment, he claims, just got more subtle, more psychological. He describes this bizarre pattern of targeted harassment centered entirely on the temperature in his room. For one whole winter, he says the heating in his room was just off, broken. He froze. Then, the very next summer, it was fixed. So well that the heat was on full blast 24/7, turning his room into a sauna. And he is adamant this was only happening in his room. And the harassment didn't stop at night. Under the excuse of welfare checks, he claims staff would come in every 2 hours like clockwork and shine a flashlight directly in his face until he woke up. It was systematic sleep deprivation. And he says it only stopped when a patient in the next room actually managed to sue the institution and win. And this is where his story takes its absolute darkest turn. He claims the staff found their most brutal tactic yet, weaponizing his own family against him. You see, his mother was also a patient there, just on a different word. He was on the phone with her one day when he suddenly heard her get attacked by another patient. He heard her screams for help, the sounds of a struggle, and then the line went dead. He was left completely enraged and totally, utterly powerless.
So, what do you do in a situation like that? He became convinced these attacks weren't random. He alleges the staff were intentionally creating these situations, orchestrating harm against his mother, knowing she would tell him, all to provoke a reaction from him that they could then use to justify more punishment. So he made a devastating choice. To protect his mother from being used as a pawn, he cut off all communication. No calls, no letters for years. His thinking was if he didn't know about the attacks, the staff would have no reason to stage them. It was a choice that plunged both of them even deeper into isolation. Years later, when they finally spoke again, he claims his mother sounded like she was on LSD, just speaking nonsense. Now this, he says, was a woman who had never touched drugs, alcohol, or even cigarettes in her entire life. He alleges that the staff, knowing she had no tolerance, deliberately gave her psychedelics to induce an actual psychosis. The goal, he says, was to discredit her in front of any outside evaluators, making sure she'd be put under forced medication permanently. Well, after hearing about his mother's situation, he finally had an outburst where he threatened a staff member. And that was all they needed. He was sent straight back to the isolation cell for another 4 months. When he got there, they stripped him and gave him the standard gown. But this time, he says, it was obviously a woman's gown. Different cut, puffy sleeves. He protested, but they just said that's all they had. He describes it as a final, deliberate act of sexual humiliation. What happened during those 4 months is mostly a blank. He says the whole period is just a blur, like a dream. The only thing he remembers is sleeping, all day, every day. He strongly suspects he was being drugged through his food, kept in a stupor while they processed a forced medication order without him even knowing. And sure enough, after 4 months, the order was passed. He was given a choice: take the medication orally or be injected. He finally relented and agreed to take the pills. And with that, he was finally allowed to leave the isolation cell, bringing this chapter of his account to a close. This account from inside what he calls Black Site Berlin is a deeply disturbing narrative of psychological torment and systemic corruption. It forces us to confront a very difficult question. What happens to the truth when the only people who witness it have already been labeled as unreliable?